I am still Sally Thomason, and I was asked to give some closing remarks. You will, I think, be happy to hear that I don't have very many of them. And I'm certainly not going to try to summarize everything we've heard today. All of it was fascinating, but we've heard it, and those of you who weren't here for the whole thing, that's your problem. I'm still not going to summarize them. However, there were a few things that stood out for me, clusters of things, particularly from different talks. And I want to say a few things about those and then a very few comments of my own to finish about revitalization. I was struck by the very similar comments by Dr. Vega and Dr. Sulyan Ziga about government policies that actively hinder revitalization, although pretending not to. Professor Vega said that in Mexico, the official government policy is good. It's supposed to be favorable to minority languages, but suppression of minority languages is still occurring in spite of the policy. Obviously, these are not the only places in the world where that's happened. And Dr. Sulyan Ziga said that the Russian government has recently passed new laws that are greatly hindering maintenance of indigenous languages, while all the time exploiting for propaganda purposes the UN Year of the Indigenous Languages as an event to be celebrated. That's interesting. It's not surprising, it's depressing, but it's very interesting. Next thing I wanted to comment on was about dialect diversity. This came up a bit in discussions I commented on in my opening remarks and in discussions of revitalization and what dialects mean for the language. Professor Vega said that dialect diversity is a sign of linguistic vitality. I think we would agree with that. It doesn't speak directly to issues of dialect reconciliation or not in revitalization projects. And Dan Kaufman said this was very striking, that in New York, speakers of Tibetic languages are assimilating to national languages in the diaspora and converging on standard Tibetan as a or the core marker of identity. That's very interesting. Again, it's not directly connected with issues of revitalization, although if it were happening in the home country rather than, or countries, rather than in diaspora, it could. And there are other places in the world where similar things have occurred. Other comments had more directly to do with revitalization, issues of revitalization. Dr. Sulyan Ziga said very significantly, there is lots of scholarly work on indigenous languages. There are quite a few people in this room who are doing that work, but there's no applied work. Obviously, there's some applied work, but there's not so much, and what's needed is practical help. He wasn't talking only about linguist actions and applied linguistics. He was also talking about governments talking about indigenous languages but not doing anything for them. But because I'm a linguist, it struck me about I have, for a very long time, been acutely aware of the fact that I do documentation, I don't do applied linguistics, and that's true of most linguists who are doing documentation work. We're trained to go out and describe languages and document them in various ways. We are not trained to be language teachers. There are, of course, linguists who are trained to be language teachers, but most people who are trained in applied linguistics as language teachers are not trained to do documentation work, and that's not their career anyway. That's not where their career is, whereas those of us who are doing documentation can make a career of it. This is a real problem. A solution that has been greatly urged on linguists and other academics interested in this work is to train community members of the endangered language communities to be linguists, applied linguists, to do the kind of work that needs to be done. Sometimes there are barriers to that. It's slow, it's happening, but it's slow. There are programs that are specifically aimed, like short term, a few weeks, 2 weeks, maybe more, to get community members in and train them to do the work that's needed for their own communities. But the fact remains that so many of us are out there doing documentation and unable. We can give resources to the community, we can give tools, but we're unable to provide lessons that will help people actually learn the language. We should be ashamed of ourselves. I'm ashamed of myself. Another issue that came up was linguistic landscapes. Dr. Nazarova talked about that, and Dan Kaufman gave us pictures of signage in Queens, and Justin Brown had pictures of signs in Cape Town. Dr. Nazarova talked about billboards, putting Uyghur on billboards in large letters rather than teeny-weeny letters. And the notion, the whole concept of linguistic landscapes is important in a number of revitalization efforts, Breton in Brittany, in various parts of the world. I don't know how important it is. It seemed important to the government of Quebec when they said that all the signs had to be in French, not English, at some point, some time ago. But it's something to keep in mind. It's a lot easier than training a lot of linguists to do applied linguistics. And finally, orthographic issues came up. Professor Vega talked about that, and from what Bruce Mannheim said, it's more complicated, it's more bound up with more things than just how do you spell things. But there are strategies, different strategies being used by endangered language communities along these lines. I mean, there's using the dominant language spelling with modifications as necessary. Jeff Heath talked about that in Morocco with Moroccan Arabic literacy, which he said has increased greatly, and he said they use Latin script with modifications. The Soviet government, I don't know what's happened in the post-Soviet era, but the Soviet government decided at some point that all languages in the Soviet Union should have a Cyrillic alphabet, and for some languages this didn't work too well because the sound systems were too different, and so they did modifications. They added diacritics, they added letters, they repurposed certain letters. It's done by a lot of communities and it works okay. Or some communities use an international phonetic alphabet-based orthography. The Montana Salish people I work with do that. It wasn't my idea. They had it before I started working there. Missionaries sometimes, some communities have had missionaries, and missionaries provided them with a writing system like the Cree syllabary, and they're very attached to the writing system, and so that's what they're using. And in the one very famous case, at least one, the Cherokees, Chief Sequoyah invented a writing system for the Cherokees, which is still used and is very important in the revitalization efforts. Political issues can complicate things. Galician in northern Spain, near the Portuguese border. I don't know if this is still true, but when I read abstracts 15 years ago, 20 maybe, for a conference I was going to there, some of the abstracts were in Galician, which was challenging since I don't even know Spanish or Portuguese. But what I noticed was that they were written in different orthographies. Some of them were written in a Spanishy orthography, and some of them were written in a Portuguese orthography. And there was dissension within the community about which of these spelling systems should be used. So it's not that I'm claiming that orthography is a simple issue, but there are solutions out there and strategies. I wrote a textbook on endangered languages, and I wrote a bunch of chapters and put the revitalization chapter at the end. And by the time I'd written all those other chapters, I was kind of depressed because everything you're writing about and reading about is loss of speakers, loss of words, loss of domains of usage, loss of cultural context where the language can be used. So you tend to come away with this sense of gloom and doom. And I was struck, for instance, today, Dr. Sulyanziga said, there is practically no chance for survival of indigenous languages in Siberia. However, this does not mean that we should give up. Correct, this does not mean that we should give up. And what I want to say finally is that total success is not the only criterion that's relevant here. Leanne Hitton and Ken Hale dedicated their edited volume, The Green Book of Language Revitalization, quote, to the brave people who work against all odds to help their endangered heritage languages survive. There is one clearly, enormously, totally successful revival effort, not even a revitalization effort, of a language, and that's modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew had, that effort had a lot going for it. It had a fiercely dedicated champion, Eliezer ben Yehuda. It had a major world religion behind it that unified the people. It had a new nation state, so they were the government. They raised the children in kibbutzim, had them raised by Hebrew-speaking caregivers. Early establishment of Hebrew medium schools. There aren't a whole lot of endangered language communities that can replicate that situation. In fact, there probably are none at all. The fiercely dedicated champions, yes, and we've heard about some today. I already said this, I'll say it again, academics, including linguists, can help as long as they understand that they're not going to be the prime movers in revitalization. But the point I want to make is that endangered language communities whose language revitalization efforts do not succeed in establishing fluent speakers and regular domains of heritage language use, the people making those efforts may still rejoice in the efforts and in their results. Even if the language vanishes, the community will have the products of the revitalization program, including dictionary, recorded narratives of personal and community history, myths, grammar lessons. All of these things will enable future generations of the community's youth to know what there was, maybe to learn the heritage language, recapture part of the old culture if they wish to. And the culture-specific vocabulary will provide insights into traditional cultural values and customs. And most importantly, these efforts can provide a newly invigorated sense of community and intergenerational closeness arising from the community-wide revitalization efforts. My last comment is an advertisement for my department. Colleen already mentioned this. On November 9th, Darrell Baldwin, who's a citizen of the Miami Nation and who was awarded a MacArthur Genius Award in 2016, I know Colleen said that, I think it bears repeating, for his truly inspiring work on reviving the Miami language. And he is an inspiring speaker. He'll be giving a colloquium at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of November 9th. On that revitalization program, it'll be announced, it'll be clearly visible on the Linguistics Department website. Thank you.